Senator Hanson Young.
Thank you, Mr Deputy President. I rise today to speak to the bill currently before this chamber that proposes to dump vulnerable men, women and children anywhere but here. A proposal put forward by this government that trashes Australia's obligations under international law and, of course, our obligations to the Refugee Convention. I note, interestingly, Mr Deputy President, that overnight the UN General Secretary Ban Ki-moon has reminded Australia that our obligations are not optional. Ban Ki-moon, of course, is calling on Australia to do what it is that we've signed up to do: treat people with dignity, respect, care and compassion when they arrive on our shores desperate for protection and safety. Australia was the 6th country to sign and ratify the Refugee Convention in 1954 under Liberal Prime Minister Robert Menzies. In Geneva on the 22nd of January in 1954, Australia's representative to the United Nations called it the Magna Carta of the refugee. He said, "I am glad now to offer further evidence of our compassionate concern with this problem by formally stating our binding adherence to a convention which will elevate the standard of treatment of refugees to the status of international legal obligation." Unquote. Erica Feller, the UNHCR Assistant Commissioner for Protection, has said that this convention is the wall behind which refugees can shelter. The importance of this convention and Australia's adherence to its obligations, Mr Deputy President, are highly understood by Australians, by members in this place and the international community. The reason why we're even having this debate on this piece of legislation is because we have vulnerable people fleeing persecution and brutality from places around the world. I want to give you a quick snapshot of one young man who's now living in Melbourne, Hatif, who had to flee the brutality of the Taliban in Afghanistan. He came to Australia seeking our protection and seeking our help. Hatif was 15 when his father was killed by the Taliban. His father, Mr Deputy President, was an interpreter for the coalition forces in Afghanistan. His father worked with our own officers, our own brave men and women in Afghanistan, so that they could understand the language, the messages, the important discussions that were being held in Afghanistan. His father acted as our interpreter to the local administration of the leaders in Afghanistan, and for that it cost him a very high price. For that, his father was killed by the Taliban. The Taliban left a note on his father's body saying that his teenage son would be next. Hatif speaks very good English. Being the son of an English interpreter who'd worked for the armed forces in Afghanistan made him a direct target once his father had been killed. His mother, sadly, realised that she would have to get Hatif out of Afghanistan if he was to survive. He was detained on Christmas Island after arriving in Australia by boat. He's now doing brilliantly at a local school in Melbourne. He's the top of the class in specialist maths and IT. He wants to be an engineer for Australia, but he desperately misses his family. I've written to the Minister about Hatif, about the fact that his family can't arrive here because there is no effective family reunion for him. The minister's bill is going to make it even harder for people like Hatif to seek the protection they deserve, the protection they need, regardless of the fact that he had no choice but to flee his country. We have a debate in this country about the pull and the push factors. The push factors are the persecutions, the brutality and the torture that individual refugees have to flee. The pull factor, Mr. Deputy President, is that Australia is a signature to the Refugee Convention, which when we signed in 1954 under the Menzies government, we proudly stood by and said that was because we understood compassion was important. That is the pull factor, Mr. Deputy President, that Australians live in a fair country, proudly in a country that looks after each other, where the vulnerable have a safety net. That is the pull factor in this debate. The deterrence, Mr. Deputy President, is the awful decision that refugees make to flee their homelands in the first place and to take that dangerous journey. The deterrence is to have to make the decision to leave, however that is, whether it's in the dead of night, whether it's in the morning, whether you take your family with you, where you go, who will accept you, what is the best avenue for safety. Having to make that decision to leave your home, your family, your community is the deterrent. Unfortunately, we have got ourselves into this awful state of affairs where both sides of this place and the other have locked themselves into a delusion that if we can deter refugees from seeking protection, that somehow that relieves us of our obligations to help others. When there are no durable solutions for refugees, when there is no ability for safety after they've left their homelands, refugees continue to flee. And they will continue to run until they feel safe. Pakistan, where many of the Afghan refugees have been hiding in fear of the Taliban, is pushing those refugees back. They are no longer safe in Pakistan, so they move on to the next place. They move to Malaysia, they move to Europe, they move to Indonesia. In our region, there is no protection for these people under law, except for those countries that have signed the Refugee Convention. Many of the people are not able to even come to Australia by plane because we don't offer them visas to get here. If you're from Afghanistan, if you're from Iraq, if you're from Iran, if you're from Syria, and the government believes you are at high risk of applying for asylum, you won't be given a visa to fly into this country. Our whole policy is designed to force people onto boats. The government doesn't want to talk about that because they'd prefer to have this tussle with the opposition about deterring people who need our help from even asking for it. That's what this whole debate is about. We don't want these refugees here, is what the minister's legislation says. It's what John Howard's legislation said. John Howard said he wanted the right to decide who came into this country and the means by which they came. This legislation says that the government will decide, and if you are a refugee coming by boat, you will not be allowed into this country. This is John Howard's legislation, Mr. Deputy President. No mistakes about it. There are a lot of mistruths about this issue. I heard the leader of the chamber here from the opposition, Senator Abetz, yesterday say there was a tsunami of refugees coming to Australia. That is a lie. It is not true. He knows it's not true. Australia takes less than 2% of the world's refugees. There is no tsunami. What there is a number of boats of very poor, desperate people who have been forced to take that journey because they have no other safer option. The expert panel asked for submissions from experts in this field, and they got submission after submission after submission that outlined what could be done to save lives now. We need to be looking at what worked in the Fraser government years. We need to be looking at how, at that time when there were many, many, many more people desperate for protection in our region at a very particular time, how we managed the needs from a humanitarian perspective. And we assessed people's claims effectively where they were, with a commitment to take those who genuinely needed our help. We didn't wait for them to board a dangerous, leaky boat only to then be shunted off, out of sight, out of mind, because the reality is we never wanted them here anyway. We had true leadership that said Australia is a signature to the Refugee Convention and we will abide by our obligations. We will work with our regional neighbours to assess people's claims, keep them safe while that application process is undertaken, and then welcome them into our communities. And we asked other countries to take them too. They went to Canada, they went to the United States, and many, many of them came to Australia. We took tens of thousands of Vietnamese refugees back in those days because it was the right thing to do. And the members of this place had the courage to do the right thing. This bill that's currently before this chamber has nothing about courage in it at all. It lacks courage, but is all about cruelty. It lacks compassion, but is all about harm. It lacks decency, but is all based on a lie. That these people don't have rights, that they're not our responsibility, and that if we be as mean as we possibly can, that will deter them. It's simply not the truth. The countries, Mr. Deputy President, by which these people are fleeing are places like Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, Sri Lanka, increasingly Syria. These are people that we know are fleeing places where they are brutalised, places of persecution. They are not here simply because they thought it was the easy option. It's the hard option. It's a hard thing to decide to leave your family, to leave your community, to leave your home, to flee in fear of your life. That is not an easy option. That takes courage. That takes bravery. That takes a commitment to humanity to save the lives of your family. They are the people that over the generations have made this country great. people who have understood hardship, loyalty, resilience. These are the people who have built this country, have contributed so much to this country, and will continue to do so. When young Hatif becomes an engineer, he will be a fine engineer. He will be probably rebuilding the infrastructure that this country desperately needs for the future, because he understands loyalty, commitment, and hard work. The Houston report included many important recommendations, none of which this government or the opposition have said any word of since Monday. Where is the commitment to increase our refugee intake immediately? Where is the plan to resettle those who have been waiting for years in Indonesia? Where in this legislation is our commitment to upholding our commitment under the Convention to treat people properly, to ensure they're housed appropriately, to ensure that they have access to legal assistance, to ensure that we don't detain children? None of that stuff, none of that important safety guards that are listed in the Houston report is in this legislation. The government says that they are implementing the Houston report, and they haven't even bothered to read the detail of the recommendations. We can be doing things now to save people's lives. Those who submitted to the Houston panel said it very clearly. Increase the ability to assess people's claims and give them an opportunity to apply for protection in Australia in the places where they are. We know they're in Malaysia. We know they're in Indonesia. Commit to doing that there and bringing them safely to Australia. This debate has become riddled with this issue of saving lives at sea. If we were saving lives at sea, Mr. Deputy President, we would be bringing these people safely to our shores. We would be giving them an opportunity to safely apply for protection in the places where they are waiting, scared, frightened, helpless, desperate. And yet that is not what this legislation is about. This is going back to the horrors that we know happened in Nauru and Manus Island. It's not staring into the tea leaves at the bottom of the cup that we know these things will happen, because they've happened before. Mr. Deputy President, before I wrap up, I'm going to table some really important pictures that were drawn by children last time they were detained on Nauru. Indefinite detention damages children. Indefinite detention violates children's rights. Indefinite detention kills people. This legislation will not save lives. This legislation will kill people. It will send brave, courageous, resilient people insane. We know it will, because it did it last time. Rather than learning from the mistakes of the past and learning from what worked in history, like the leadership that was taken by the former Prime Minister Malcolm Fraser, this government has lost their way. This government has lost their moral compass. This government is doing what Tony Abbott asked for, and Tony Abbott cannot be trusted on people's human rights. Tony Abbott wants to be as cruel as possible to the most vulnerable people who reach our shores. I condemn the bill, and we will not be supporting it in this place.